To introduce myself. My name is Matteo Pretelli. I teach American history here at the University of Naples, Orientale. And we have this event today because exactly 8 years ago, the Japanese aviation bombed the US naval base in Pearl Harbor in the Hawaii. The attack pushed President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to talk about December the 7th as a date that will live in infamy. The United States joined World War II, and a few days afterwards, Italy and Germany declared war on the United States as well. So the US were part of a global war. So today, after 80 years, it seems opportune to discuss about the global impact of Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor produced different memories across the globe, including Europe and, of course, Italy. So in order to discuss these themes, I and my colleague Stefano Silva from the University of Naples Orientale thought to invite to talk one of the major experts of American war memory, Professor John Bodnar from Indiana University, whom I thank very much for being here. Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to have you. And I also have to say that this webinar is organized together with the U.S. Consulate in Naples, whose staff I thank very much for the continuous precious collaboration we have together. So today, Professor Bodnar will talk about Pearl Harbor, the politics of war and memory. And this lecture will be pretty much a traditional in format because it's going to talk for more or less 45 minutes, followed by Q&As. So I do invite all students and all participants to write in the chat to pose questions to our guest. Before to introduce Professor Bodnar, I would like to leave the floor to my colleague, Professor Paolo Wulzer, who is Vice Director of our Department of Human and Social Sciences and the Director of the Centro di Studi sull'Europa Continentale. So I invite Paolo to the floor to bring the salute from the department. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to give some opening remarks to the very important, very relevant seminar. I teach History of International Relations. I'm also Deputy Director of the Department of Human and Social Sciences. So I'm very pleased to introduce this very remarkable seminar devoted to the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and its impact on the on U.S. history and society and politics. This is a very important meeting for our department. First of all, because the U.S. history and politics has a relevant part in our scientific program and also in our teaching program in international relations. We are very pleased also to host this seminar because it is organized in cooperation with the Consulate General of the United States in Naples. There is a long-standing tradition of cooperation between our department and our university and the Consulate of the US in Naples. So we hope that this cooperation will last in the future, and this seminar is an important step in our mutual program of exchange and organizing scientific initiatives. And also I'm very pleased, of course, because we have as a keynote speaker, Professor Bodnar, who is a leading expert in U.S. history, in U.S. Cultural and political history. I'm very sorry, I won't be able to attend all the seminar because we are currently engaged in the discussion of the final dissertation of our MA program in international relations. So I will stay with you for the first steps of our seminar. Then I have to leave. Now I guess I am giving the floor back to Matteo Pretelli, who will chair our meeting. And thanks, Matteo, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Paolo, very much. Just want to thank right now the U.S. Consulate in Naples because, as I said, many activities, many events we organize in Naples is thanks to the fruitful collaboration coming from the consulate itself. So I'm particularly happy to thank Dr. Karen Schinnerer, who is a U.S. Consulate Public Affairs Officer in Naples. So I just leave to Karen the floor in order to bring her greetings and to introduce Professor Bodnar. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Buonasera a tutti. I'm just going to ask our other panelists to mute if you're done speaking, just so we don't get the background noise. Our general technology Zoom rules that we're slowly all becoming accustomed to as we continue in this hybrid in-person and virtual format. So I'm Karen Schinnerer. I'm the head of the press and cultural section here at the U.S. Consulate General in Naples. It's my pleasure to join all of you today across Napoli and possibly others joining from other parts of Italy as we look back at the historical significance of today's events that impacted both the United States and Italy. I would like to first thank Professor Wulzer and Professor Matteo Pretelli for taking the time to work with us and organize this event as part of Orientale's American Studies program. You're a key contact and we greatly appreciate your ongoing support. And a big thanks to Professor John Bodner for joining from Indiana University, taking the time to be with us this afternoon during your morning and share your expertise. So as we heard from Professor Pretelli, 80 years ago today, Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii was attacked by Japanese military forces. It immediately became a significant and horrific event for America and Americans. Lives were lost. There was a devastating impact for the US military. And suddenly gone was the idea that had been in play in our politics that with an ocean on each side of the United States, we could be protected from foreign entanglements. This event, of course, led to other events, as noted by Professor Pretelli. The United States entered World War II against Japan, and shortly thereafter, both Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Yet today, in 2021, who are some of the key US allies? Japan, Germany, and of course, Italy. So what can we learn from history and those that have experienced it? How does politics, both past and present, intersect with history? Does culture play a role as well? And to what extent? Our own cultures and cultures that are around the world. Today, we will discuss these intersections of history, politics, and culture to better understand our shared history and to consider today's partnerships. A partnership between the United States and Italy that includes economic engagement, security alliances, and is based in our shared values. It's not only a bilateral partnership, but a multilateral one. The United States with NATO, Italy's relationship with NATO, and both our countries' relationship with the United Nations and peacekeeping missions around the world. So finally, I would like to introduce Professor John Bodner. He's a respected scholar of modern history, modern US history at Indiana University. His current research project is rather in-depth. It focuses on the representation of violence in American memory and culture, with a particular interest in political and cultural struggle between heroic and traumatic experiences that follow episodes of state-sponsored violence. Professor Bodner's publications include several articles and books, including his latest, Divided by Terror, Patriotism Since 9/11. He is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Florence Chair in American History at the European University Institute in Florence, assigned by the Fulbright Commission in 1994. At Indiana University, he has won the Teaching Excellence Award and the Distinguished Faculty Award. Finally, just another reminder to everybody to please, at any point during the presentation, feel free to write your comments and questions in the chat. I believe most everyone here speaks English, but if you're more comfortable writing your question in Italian, that is fine too. Now I invite Professor Bodner to start his presentation and for Marco from our tech department to share the PowerPoint.
Hello, I hope you all can hear me. Good. Buongiorno to everyone in Italy and wherever else you might be. I'm going to speak today about Pearl Harbor, but I'm going to focus on the way it has been remembered especially in the United States and Japan, with some references to Italy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, is a famous event in modern history because it led to the beginning of America's entrance into World War II. And the war itself reshaped the course of events, not only in the United States and in Europe, but in Japan and East Asia as well. The main problem I want to deal with today is what I would suggest is a problem of the relationship between the participation in war and the way nations choose to recall those events and all of the violence and all of the tragedy that war entails. The basic general point, I think, is this. While nations are often quick to descend into episodes of extreme violence, once wars are completed, they tend to work with a great deal of enthusiasm and effort to basically erase or forget the extensive record and experience of trauma and suffering that those wars entail. And I hope to show today that in both Japan and the United States, and to some extent in Italy, nations and peoples who experienced the war worked extremely hard to turn the memory of the war into something less traumatic, and less bloody, if you will, and less sordid than the actual events of the 1940s. So that by the time we enter a more modern era, 10 and 20 and 40 and 60 years after World War II, these nations are either forgetting much of what they endured and precipitated in the 1940s, or are also presenting themselves as more noble and virtuous nations than their wartime activities might suggest. In the case of Japan, you'll hear me talk about the fact that the Japanese began to promote themselves as advocates of peace and advocates of nuclear disarmament, especially after suffering the traumas of the atomic bombings. In the United States, the bloody war with Japan and in World War II overall, the United States begins to remember World War II as a good war fought by a great generation, noble, patriotic people who don't seem to have within their being the capacity to generate the sort of violence they actually did in the 1940s. And in Italy, we seem to have a sense that Italy began to talk about their experience in World War II in terms of the Italians being brava gente, or good people who are basically now, if you will, ardent Democrats, and I'm not saying they're not, and certainly not the heirs of the fascist realities that pervaded Italy in the 1930s and 1940s. So if...
Professor, may I just jump in?
Yes.
Can you just let us know when the presentation needs to start?
Have you heard me so far?
No, I just wanted to double check that you let us know when you want the PowerPoint up and started.
Okay, but you've been hearing me so far.
Oh yes, we can hear you loud and clear. I just wanted to
Let's-
remind you on that tech aspect. No worries at all. We're hearing the wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Let's have the first slide. Let's go. Perfect. And you can still hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear
Yes,
you.
we can hear
Yes,
you
we
great.
can. Yes, we can.
Good. So that graphic is sort of a depiction of the Japanese attack in 1941 on December the 7th. And immediately Americans began to insist that all Americans remember Pearl Harbor and remember that it was an event that should cause them to work hard, to fight, and to sacrifice to extract revenge against the Japanese. Next slide. That's a current rendition of one of the ways Americans remember Pearl Harbor today. That's a photograph of a small piece of sculpture on the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was dedicated in 2004. And you see a supposedly typical American family. Notice it's intergenerational. There's grandparents, parents, and children, something that might be a little less likely today. And they're all intently listening to the radio. And of course, they're listening with a sense of soberness. They're getting the news that, as many Americans got the news on a Sunday morning on December the 7th, that the Japanese had just attacked Pearl Harbor. There's no sign of emotion or anger or vengeance. They are just simply processing the news of this sudden attack. Next slide. That's another piece of sculpture on the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. And those are American men now lining up to join the military. You can see they're undergoing a physical. Then they are pledging to defend the Constitution. They're raising their right hands against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then on the extreme right of the extreme end, you see them now with a military uniform marching off to war. They have reacted to Pearl Harbor as sober citizens, more than ready to defend their country. There's no hint of any sort of emotion or any sense of fear or anger. They're just now ready to go to war. Their patriotism, in a sense, is natural or inevitable or innate. Next slide. Vengeance, however, was one of the key terms to explain how Americans felt in 1941. The sort of sober reception of the news and the sort of business approach to joining the military and fighting that's depicted in the war memorial does not depict or does not capture the sense of anger and revenge, and as you'll see, racism that permeated the United States upon the news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so many posters, like the ones you see to avenge Pearl Harbor, were distributed throughout the United States with the intent to fight back. Next slide, please. Thank you. Part of that emotionalism of 1941 and that desire to strike back at the Japanese was, and you can see this in the documents and the material of the times, was the call not only for revenge, but to kill the Japanese. That poster is a photograph of one of the Navy admirals of the United States in the Pacific, William Halsey. And he's basically saying in that poster to Americans, work hard, basically in war jobs, don't waste your time. And as he says, we can kill more Japs if you kill less time. In other words, work hard, don't waste your time, build guns, the planes, and the ships that we need so we can kill Japs. And there was a lot of talk about killing Japs. Some of the first responses of Americans to the news of Pearl Harbor was to join the military so they could kill someone from Japan or Japanese soldiers. There was a sort of a blood vengeance that we certainly didn't see to that same extent in the conflict against Germany at the same time. Next slide. The sort of racist element in the American outlook toward the Japanese after the news of Pearl Harbor is depicted in many ways. That's a cartoon, a poster. There were many posters like that in the United States in 1941. And the Japanese are always usually portrayed as almost animal-like, despicable. And you can see in that particular poster the knife in the female figure's back. Pearl Harbor is seen as a stab in the back. At the time, we were engaged in negotiations with the Japanese to settle some of our differences in the Pacific. And while those negotiations were going on, the attack at Pearl Harbor takes place. And that contributes to the idea that the Japanese can't be trusted, that they're not only, that they're basically treacherous people, and as we'll see in a few seconds, also people who are not as well as advanced, certainly technologically and in many other ways, as the West and as the United States. Next slide. That's a cartoon. That's a photograph taken of a cartoon that was played in American theaters right after 1941, again, portraying the Japanese in a sort of demeaning way. And that cartoon is also a sort of making fun or expressing the point that the Japanese were not nearly as advanced in terms of civilization and technology as the United States or the West. And so that sort of superior attitude is shown in this portrayal of what's supposed to be a Japanese air raid siren, which is here nothing more than one Japanese man sticking another Japanese man in the buttocks with a needle. And when he screams, that's their air raid siren. Of course, a metaphorical way of debunking the technological abilities of the Japanese, although they had just shown some fairly high degree of technology by orchestrating the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. Next slide. Well, Benito Mussolini does the United States, or at least its President Roosevelt, a favor because he had been looking for ways to sort of get in the war against the Germans. He was helping the British already. He was certainly inclined to do all he could to stop Hitler's expansion in Europe. And because of a treaty between Germany, Italy, and Japan, when Japan attacked the United States, Mussolini, 4 days later, after December 7th, declared war on the United States. And 3 days after Mussolini declared war on the United States and after Pearl Harbor, Hitler joined in the fray. And so that particular Italian poster, 3 People, 1 War, is supposed to convey the idea that the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians would somehow bond together to fight the Americans or fight what the leader of the Americans, President Roosevelt, whom Mussolini referred to as a tyrannical Democrat, an interesting term, ironic in many ways. Next slide. So The attack on Pearl Harbor not only intensified already existing racism against the Japanese that existed in this country, and as you'll see, against Japanese Americans, but it also had some unfortunate consequences for other ethnic groups in America. The Italians now came under some degree of suspicion, Italians in America, and so did the Germans. And for a while, some Italians and Germans, especially those that were not naturalized, were declared enemy aliens. Next slide. I was particularly struck when preparing this talk about the impact that Pearl Harbor and the fact that America and Italy were now at war, as well as America and Japan, the impact that it had on Italian Americans. The Italian American community at this point in the United States, as many of you know, is quite large. There are millions of Italian immigrants and their children now settled in the US. And the reason that the impact is interesting and significant is that before Pearl Harbor, most Italian Americans were quite proud of Mussolini's accomplishments. There were many fundraising drives in large cities where Italian Americans had congregated, like Boston or New York or San Francisco, to raise money for the Italian Red Cross. Mussolini had a lot of fans among Italian Americans in New York after he invaded Ethiopia. Most of the Italian American press was strongly behind Mussolini. Italian Americans tended to express pride in the achievements and the rising power of Italy. And they were becoming a little disillusioned with Roosevelt, because Roosevelt, of course, was trying to push America into a war against fascist powers in Europe. And many Italian Americans were not particularly approving of the criticism that Roosevelt was leveling against fascist powers in Europe, including, of course, Italy. But all that changed with Pearl Harbor. Quickly, Italian American newspapers began to drop their pro-Mussolini rhetoric. They began to call for complete loyalty to the United States. There were some Italians and Germans who were declared enemy aliens, very small numbers who were actually incarcerated during most of the war. But the designation for enemy aliens was soon dropped for Italian Americans, because Roosevelt realized that the next year he would need the support of Italian American votes, which was very prominent in the Democratic Party, or had been, and he didn't want to further alienate the Italian American vote. And so they dropped the enemy designations in any way toward Italians. And plus, Italian Americans had enough political clout to see that that designation was dropped, and that any suspicion that anyone might have about Italian American loyalty could now be overlooked. You can see that photograph of a young man at an Italian market in New York City, showing you with some spaghetti how he could break Mussolini's neck if, in fact, he get the chance. And of course, it's in 1942. Next slide, please. Japanese Americans didn't fare as well as the Italian Americans, even though they were enemies. While there certainly was discrimination against Italian Americans before the 1940s in this country, there was real hostility toward Japanese Americans on the West Coast, where most of them lived. Japanese immigration was banned in the US in 1924. And Pearl Harbor makes that situation worse for Japanese Americans. And as many of you may know, most of the Japanese Americans living in the US were forced to leave their jobs, leave their homes, leave most of their belongings, and they were put on trains and taken to internment camps that were scattered all over the western parts of the United States. And Most of them spent the war basically as prisoners, except for those those Japanese American men who were willing to volunteer to fight. Although the Japanese American soldiers were never allowed to serve in the Navy because they were feared that they might be disloyal if they were in the Pacific. And so Japanese American soldiers that did fight bravely in World War II for the US mostly all fought in Europe. Next slide. That's a slide or photograph of one of the Japanese American internment camps. Pearl Harbor sent those people into those camps. That particular photograph looks to me like it's in California. It's at a large internment camp near the Sierra Nevada mountains. You're looking east, and so that Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean are over on the other side of those mountains. Next slide. The main memory of Pearl Harbor in the United States was focused on the sacrifice that the American men, soldiers, Navy, Marines, Army made at Pearl Harbor. Some 2,400 were killed. And that's a photograph of the memorial that was built over a sunken ship. That's the hulk of the USS Arizona. It was blown to bits. On December 1941, over 1,100 sailors, Marines were trapped inside. Their remains are still inside. Whatever is left of them are still inside that ship. And tourists can come and visit the memorial, which was dedicated in 1962, to pay their respects to the American dead. And in fact, the design of that memorial is supposed to sort of imply something of the narrative of World War II for Americans, and that is that it's lower in the middle and higher at the ends, meaning we took a setback at Pearl Harbor, but then we mobilized our forces and fought back heroically and sacrificed and won the war. But it's the sacrifice of those soldiers and the way that Americans begin to talk about them as noble patriots whose patriotism was innate, natural, and there's no sense there, as there is no sense in the sculptures that I showed you at the World War II Memorial, that Americans are angry, seeking to murder or kill or revenge, and have any sort of racist tendencies. Next slide. That's simply a depiction of it's a box in which you can buy a government film that was made in 1942. And it's a government made by the American Propaganda Office of War Information that gives people a photographic record of what happened on December the 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor. And the interesting thing about that film, and I think it's available online, it's called December 7th, the Pearl Harbor Story, is that it shows a little bit of the destruction of the ships. You see there is some film footage of the attacks at Pearl Harbor, but then it switches to photographs of some of the men who served and died at Pearl Harbor, and we just see their photographs. Most of them are smiling. There's no confirmation or sense that some of them may have been killed or destroyed. And then we interestingly see film footage of some of their parents who are going about their daily lives as if nothing happened. In other words, we see the soldiers and we see the parents of the soldiers, and they look happy and living normal lives, but we don't get the trauma, we don't get the pain. We not only don't get the anger and the racism, we don't get the suffering that so many felt, both at Pearl Harbor and in homes where loved ones were lost. Next slide. By 1991, at the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the USS Arizona Memorial that you've just seen is a huge tourist attraction, and Americans are celebrating Pearl Harbor and celebrating the vets. That's a parade that was held in Honolulu in 1991. Some 2,000 American veterans from Pearl Harbor are marching. It started to rain. No one was going to let the rain stop the celebration. And the crowd broke spontaneously into a rendition of God Bless America. This now was a remembrance of Pearl Harbor, where the men who fought were part of the greatest generation apparently that ever lived, that the war was a good war, and the legacy of sorrow, anger, and racism was being left far behind. Next slide. That sort of celebration and that focus on the patriotism of the men who served is sort of tarnished a bit and blunted a bit in the last 5 or 6 or 8 years with the discovery of what DNA could do. As DNA became more understood and available, military officials, as elsewhere, began to realize that if you could get samples of relatives' DNA and match it to the samples of some of the bones that were still collected at Pearl Harbor, then you might be able to identify to whom the bones belonged. Some of those ships in Pearl Harbor were not raised until several years after the attack. And so by the time they raised the ships, like a ship like the USS Oklahoma, which was sunk with over 400 men aboard, they had nothing but skulls and bones. And the skulls and bones were just buried. And so, they had one pile for skulls, one pile for bones, and they were marked as remains from Pearl Harbor. But people in those that lost those loved ones had no idea what happened to some of their relatives during the attack. Next slide. But in the last 5 or 6 years, as the use of DNA allowed military officials to discover the identities of the bones, families at home were notified that some of the remains of their loved ones would be coming home. And we started to get a whole series of news interviews with reporters talking to families about how do they feel about the fact that their loved ones, like that particular man, Roy Thins, who died in the Navy at Pearl Harbor, that he was finally identified. His remains were finally brought home this year. He was buried in Wisconsin. And we now read in the newspaper stories of how families dealt with the loss of loved ones. And it's not that they didn't feel their loved ones or kin were patriots, but their remembrance of Pearl Harbor and those that died was more mournful and more sorrowful. And so we get so many stories of how families remembered. For example, in Thin's case, his mother, for the rest of her life, until she died, would sit in a rocking chair waiting for a knock on the door that he was finally home. She reasoned that he may have been disoriented at Pearl Harbor. She said maybe he had amnesia and he didn't know how to find his way home. Other families told stories of how every year they would gather to have a drink, to toast a loved one that was lost, how they cried for years, how they wished they had known someone who was killed and they never got a chance to meet, how they kept mementos and souvenirs, the telegrams that came to their home indicating that their loved one was missing. One family talked about how they kept a wooden heart that a relative who was killed had given to a woman that he was going to marry. And so we get this sort of stories of sadness and tragedy and sorrow that sort of drifted a good deal from the sort of celebration of the good war and the high level of patriotism that had come to dominate the American memory of Pearl Harbor in World War II. Next slide. Japan is a different story. Next slide. In Japan, December the 7th was December the 8th. They were a day ahead of us. And on December the 8th, 1941, the Japanese were celebrating the what they perceived to be a dramatic victory over the Americans at Pearl Harbor. That particular individual, Yoshiko Sakamoto, wrote about, as many Japanese wrote about what they remembered from Pearl Harbor. And she said it seemed like a festival that day. There were people who were in the streets shouting, "We won, we won." And as Americans talked about revenge and killing, the Japanese celebrated what seemed to be a dramatic victory over what they felt was a Western power that had not treated them well for decades. Japan had already been at war before December the 7th. Japan had been working to create an empire throughout East Asia. They had inflicted all kinds of violence and brutality, especially in China, and the rape of Nanking. And the Japanese people before Pearl Harbor were used to getting reports of battles and battle victories, if that were the case. The Japanese would often pause in those years for a moment of silence to celebrate and support their troops that were now spread all over East Asia. And they were told then to face and look toward wherever they were, to look toward Tokyo and to pray for the souls of the dead soldiers and to support those that were still alive. Next slide. Takamura Kotaro wrote a long poem which became fairly famous in Japan called December the 8th. And he sees in the poem, and by the way, there's many other examples I could have given you of people remembering, of poetry, of writings, etc. We don't have that much time. But in Kotaro's poem, he sees Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, obviously not as a setback in the U.S., as it was in the U.S., but a justification and retribution for the victimization from what he called Anglo-Saxon powers for a century in the Pacific. Next slide. That's a quote from Kotaro's poem. Remember, and he says, "Remember December the 8th, the power of Anglo-America, monopolist of global wealth, was denied in our own country. Our denial was justice." In other words, we had every right to attack the Americans. And there was always a thread of that argument that remained in terms of the Japanese memory of Pearl Harbor and the war that it precipitated with the United States. The Japanese argued that the Americans were trying to cut off their oil supplies, and they had a fully justified reason to strike back and attack the American naval power so their oil supplies wouldn't be disrupted, although those oil supplies were also fueling a military machine that was wreaking havoc through East Asia. Next slide. Because of the devastation that World War II and the battle with the Americans brought to Japan, 2 atomic bombings, millions of Japanese killed, both civilian and military, throughout East Asia and with the Americans, the Japanese soldiers were denied the heroism that the Americans were able to draw upon in their memory and the way they dominated the American memory of Pearl Harbor in the war. And so that photograph is after the war of a Japanese veteran begging and borrowing for handouts, for money, because the Japanese veterans and even the Japanese who were disfigured by the atomic bombs were usually looked with disdain and ignored often by their own countrymen who didn't want to be reminded of that particular defeat. Next slide. That's a photograph of the Asconi Shrine in Tokyo. Unlike a military cemetery in the United States, and there, by the way, there are American military cemeteries in Italy from World War II, some of which I've seen. The Asconi Shrine was a place where the souls, not the bodies, but the souls of Japanese soldiers who served the emperor and served Japan were meant to be placed. And the souls were reposing there now in this mystical sense. And people would visit Asconi to pay honor to the sacrifice that the soldiers made. But when the Americans defeated the Japanese, they didn't want the Japanese to honor their military, and they wanted to erase that possibility. So the Americans closed down Asconi so the Japanese couldn't honor the veterans who served their nation. And that became a point of contention, etc. Once the Americans left in 1952, then the Japanese began to open up Asconi again so they could honor the souls of those who fought and honor the veterans. Next slide. Those are veterans now in the vicinity of Asconi, honoring the war dead, which was not really allowed so much through the 1950s. Next slide. But the primary memory of Pearl Harbor in World War II in Japan was not that it was a good war. In fact, it wasn't a good war for the Japanese at all, but that it brought so much destruction to Japan that Japan tried to change its identity now and insisted that it had learned its lesson and it was now never going to be militaristic again, and it was now going to be an advocate for peace. And so you can see those demonstrators in recent years saying, we don't want any more war, and we don't want people honoring the dead soldiers at Asconi because we're now advocates of peace. Next slide. So as the USS Arizona, which is the central commemorative point for Pearl Harbor for Americans in Honolulu, is over the bulk of a sunken ship to honor the dead American soldiers and celebrate the victory and the patriotism that the men showed. The central commemorative event for Pearl Harbor and the war in Japan is the Hiroshima Peace Park. Hiroshima, the site of American atomic bomb dropped on Japan, killing many innocents as well, innocent people, is now using the victimization of the Japanese, moving away from their perpetrators of violence in East Asia and using that victimization to show there's a bombed out building from Hiroshima, that in fact they are now interested in peace. Next slide. That's the Hiroshima Children's Monument. There are many monuments in the Peace Park at Hiroshima. And on top, there's a crane on top of a young girl. The young girl is someone who was killed during the atomic bombs, a figure of that individual. And those cranes continue to be made throughout the world as examples of how children should now be interested in the whole idea of creating a more peaceful world with no nuclear weapons. And this sort of moves Japan away from its association with the violence of World War II and Pearl Harbor. Next slide. Again, the bones. Just as we begin to discover who the bones belong to in the United States because of DNA, and those bones trigger a series of news reports that give us a more mournful and a little less celebratory remembrance of Pearl Harbor in World War II. Now we see the Japanese, especially after 10 and 15 years after the war, beginning to move around places, especially in Okinawa, to collect the human remains and bones that were strewn all over that area. Okinawa, the southern part of Japan, was the site of one of the most bloody battles of World War II between the Americans and the Japanese. And many Japanese civilians, in fact, more civilians were killed at Okinawa than Japanese soldiers. So after the war, even though many in Japan are against militarism and want to create a sort of peace identity for the Japanese, Hundreds of people are walking over the ground at Okinawa and collecting the bones, and they don't know if the bones belong to the Japanese or the Americans. They're just collecting remains to honor their dead, to mourn their dead, for families looking for lost loved ones, in many ways reuniting with lost loved ones, at least on a spiritual sense, as Americans did with the DNA test in the US. And in Okinawa, we begin to see people erecting war memorials that are more explicit about the tragedy and the trauma that the war entailed. Next slide. So those are people recently praying at a ceremony at a peace memorial in Okinawa, because of course the idea that the World War II and Pearl Harbor was about learning the value of peace is certainly powerful in Okinawa. But next slide. But Okinawa is also now putting memorials up with the names of the dead, and they even put up the names of American dead as well as Japanese dead. A more universal sense of acknowledging the tragedy of war, certainly undermining ideas that war can lead to discoveries that war made Japan simply a more peaceful nation, forgetting all that it had done, and also really, in a sense, contesting the American sense that war was simply a good war and less willing to let the dead become front and center in terms of the commemoration of the war. Next slide. And in Okinawa, we can get a war memorial like this, which is a mausoleum that contains the ashes of 180,000 dead. American dead, who knows? It's the remains are burned. You've got the ashes. You see memorials with ashes like this at some of the concentration camp memorials in Europe. But this would not have been possible at Asconi with the ashes of all the dead. But in Okinawa, feeling the brunt of so much of the battle and so much of it left behind, Japan's efforts to reappear as a peaceful nation continue to be challenged today by the realities of death, whether it's the names of the dead or the memorials like that with the remains or the ashes of human remains. Next slide. So Italy was impacted by World War II, as you all know. Pearl Harbor, we see, brought Italy into brought Italy and Germany into a war against the United States. The Italian-American population was significantly affected by Pearl Harbor. And it struck me just a little bit here at the end that Italy too had to experience or confront the same realities that the United States and Japan did. And they had to confront the harsh realities, the bitter realities of war. In the United States, we had descended after Pearl Harbor into a state of vengeance and racism, and imposed phenomenal amounts of destruction and inhuman slaughter in the far Pacific. Japan had to confront the realities that they had basically raped, pillaged, and killed all through East Asia, and then started a war with the United States, which led to so much devastation in their homeland. And so the United States eventually moved to erase much of the darkness of the war by seeing themselves as a greatest generation that fought a good war. The Japanese began to think of themselves as advocates for peace, and to some extent the Italians began to think of themselves, looking back upon their fascist experience in the 30s and all the bloodshed that came to Italy as brava gente, or good people, centered usually on the memory, certainly not of the fascist or all of the harshness that went on in Italy, but on the heroic resistance, or the resistance, which became certainly one of the key tropes of Italian memory of the war. Next slide. So that memorial in Civitella is, of course, many of you know, relates to the killing of Italian males in the village in 1944. It was in the Germans killing the men in the village because of retaliation for the Italian resistance in that area, killing some of the Germans. The sculpture is, I'm not sure how clear it's coming across, but it basically shows women and children, and they had hid in the woods during the killing of the men, and they come back into the Civitella to find most of the men, their fathers, brothers, etc., murdered. And it's basically expressing, in a sense, the sorrow and the tragedy of that particular massacre, and in a sense, implicitly raising questions about the resistance itself, which, of course, is seen as heroic and the beginning, the end of fascism, the beginning of the Republic. But there's the question of, well, but also the resistance, their acts could lead to horrendous slaughter. And there's something in the scholarship, some of you may know, a fair amount of discussion today about how the resistance is even questioned by some, not all, of course, as to whether some of their acts perpetrated such violence against Italian civilians. And there's certainly a question, some people who regret that. Next slide. And the focus on the resistance, again, that's, some of you probably have been in Bologna, in the middle of Bologna, have seen that monument. Those are photographs of Italian partisans who fought against the fascists as the Germans withdrew to the north, etc. And they are still certainly honored by some, but there is a fair amount of, again, discussion about the fact that the honoring of the resistance has somehow minimized the continued suffering that many Italians went on. That if we keep talking about resistance, we've tended not to talk enough about the suffering of civilians where there was retribution. It could have possibly minimized, some would argue, the fact that there were some deportation of Jews in Italy, not in the large numbers we saw in other countries for sure, etc. Italian scholars like Gabriella Bribaldi, who has made it clear that the focus on the resistance and the sort of heroic triumph over fascism has sort of diminished some of the focus on the victimization of Italian women, the mass rapes near Monte Cassino, etc. And so war is sordid stuff, and it leads to a lot of trauma and bitter realities, but it also leads in commemoration and memory to sort of massive efforts to sort of diminish the suffering and to present to the world national identities that are much more virtuous than past realities might suggest. So that's the essence of my discussion, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for this fascinating talk. You touched on a number of different issues. I don't want to comment right now because we can definitely leave the room to the audience and students in particular to pose their questions. So maybe Karen, if you could please tell us what they asked.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to remind our audience to feel free to type your question in the chat. Again, you can type in English or Italian. But Professor Bodner, we do have a question in from Antonio Jr. Lucchini, and he says, good evening. What was the impact of the war record of the 442nd Combat Regiment, mostly made up of Japanese Americans, on U.S. perceptions given their ethnic group? Were Japanese American veterans subject to the same racist attitudes experienced by civilians, as you discussed?
That's a good question. He's referring to a regiment of Japanese Americans who fought in Europe. Today in the United States, those Japanese soldiers are honored and revered. Their sacrifice has been noted. They are seen as heroic veterans and celebrated. But it took a long time for that idea to become firmly established. And so for 40 and 50 years after the war, you didn't hear a lot in American textbooks or in American society about the incarceration of the Japanese Americans or the fighters in the Japanese regiments, because it raised also the specter of the incarceration. Over time, even within the Japanese American community, there was a debate: should we feature the fact that we were put in prison camps, or should we feature our heroism? And because those in prison camps wanted sort of wanted compensation, but eventually the heroic sacrifice, excuse me, or the war participation of the Japanese soldiers was recognized.
Thank you, Professor. No, it certainly is interesting how attitudes shift over time, but then I also can recall from my time serving in Manila in the Philippines, sometimes it takes a champion too in order to fight for some of those rights, whether it's within the community or in a politician. I remember one of the senators from Hawaii fought long and hard for many of the benefits for some of the Filipino as well as Japanese veterans. We have another question in from another student from Orientale. Considering the humorous way in which America made its propaganda in order to incite the fight against Japan with the cartoons, billboards, and advertisements that you showed, was there any similar propaganda put out by the Japanese?
Yes, I don't have any slides of that, I'm sorry, etc. But I alluded to that and to the point about how many in Japan felt their attack was totally justified. One, they felt it was a reasonable for them to destroy the power of the U.S. Navy so they could continue to get their oil supplies. But more than that, they definitely felt that they had been mistreated by Western powers, not respected. And so, yes, there was a lot of discussion. You saw some of it in the poetry of not so much. Well, in a sense, they were inferring that there was an attitude of superiority or racial superiority on the part of the West that justified the Japanese striking back. Yes, and there was some, if you will, cartoonish characterizations of Americans. It didn't last long, though, because the war became so, in a sense, so traumatic for the Japanese.
Great, thank you again. So I guess moving into a larger context, we have another question with regards to how this one event of the attack in Oahu on Pearl Harbor, how that ended up, signifying and cascading into the greater world war of events. And do you envision another event like this happening, or another struggle in a part of the world where at this particular moment it could have a similar impact? Like one event could have such a reverberation, or are there other more recent examples that you might have to give from your research?
It's a good question. Obviously, it's impossible to answer entirely or accurately, but one of the things we had both with World War I and World War II, as some of you know, excuse me, the more I talk, the more I cough. In World War I and World War II, a lot of those wars and those battles were triggered by treaties where there was these mutual defense treaties. So if somebody goes to war, they shoot the Archduke Ferdinand. So all of a sudden the Germans and the British are fighting each other. The same thing, Mussolini and Hitler have a treaty with Japan. I don't know the extent that those treaties exist today because some of them may not be public. It does seem like there's a little bit more reluctance today. I mean, for example, the current crisis, or what seems to be something of a crisis, where the Russians are possibly threatened to invade the Ukraine. And Putin is obviously upset over the fact that Ukraine and NATO is coming closer to the Russian borders. Could that precipitate or China attacking Taiwan? Could that precipitate something larger? I don't know. We now have we now have nuclear weapons, but we also have the knowledge of what nuclear weapons could do. And since World War II, we've seemed to sort of be willing to keep back from that line, that sort of catastrophe. So I think there's a little bit more reluctance to get into full-scale massacres in ways that were in the 1940s, but human nature is human nature. We'll see.
Yes, hopefully the alliances and partnerships that we've forged will help to counterbalance some of those things. But as you said, we can never predict what may or may not happen. Matteo, I'll turn the floor over to you for comment and question.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, I have a few questions for John. The first one connects to what Antonio Lucchini, who was actually a student of mine, was asking to you. Japanese Americans, somebody wants you.
It's all right, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I was asking about Japanese Americans. We have this sort of dichotomy among those who have been interned and the others who actually participated to the conflict with the Allies during World War II. The Japanese Americans have been one of the most awarded regiments in the history of the American forces. I'm just wondering if you had chance to check for memories, the memoirs of these people, those interned or those who fought. And in particular, I'm wondering if they had a sort of reflection upon Pearl Harbor. What is Pearl Harbor for these people? A day of infamy? Was the Japanese government who actually made a mistake? I would be curious to know about that. And this is somehow connect to what happened in Japan as well. I was particularly interested about the Kotaro's poem and the way he tried to justify Pearl Harbor as a sort of setback, a reaction against the Americans. You also stressed how the main memory in Japan is about peace, about pacifism. But I'm just wondering how extended was the Kotaro's ideas in contemporary Japan, in post-war Japan? How many people, which kind of groups could eventually had a sort of pro-Pearl Harbor attack? I hope I've been clear enough.
You've been clear enough, but you asked a lot of questions at once. So let's do the first part and then remind me to go back to Japan. Okay.
Okay.
First part is about the Japanese Americans. There's a lot to say there. In terms of how they remember it, let me just briefly talk about the Japanese Americans who were not in the continental United States. They lived in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And a large, substantial part of the Japanese, of the population of Hawaii, was maybe I think a third, were Japanese or Japanese American.
Yeah.
And therefore, they were not put in internment camps.
Yes.
They were too significant a political force and too significant a workforce to be incarcerated. A few were. There were a few that were under some sort of suspicion, and they were put in. There was an internment camp in Honolulu that was filled mostly with Japanese POWs from the war, but it did contain a few Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens in Hawaii, not very many. And so the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, as they talk about it and remember it, were mad at Japan. They felt they brought upon them a disfavor that they didn't need or want, etc. And so they were, and they obviously felt that they had, and they didn't have much to do with any of this at all. So their memory was rather critical of Japan. The Japanese Americans in the United States were mostly internment camps. The memories of the internment camps are sort of twofold and sort of vied for attention of the Japanese American community after the war. There are many memoirs of the camps as being pleasant enough, but there was no heat. We froze in the wintertime. How could they do this to us? But at least, you know, we weren't being killed, although there was a fear in the Japanese American community that they all would be killed right after Pearl Harbor. There was a rumor that the Americans were going to come and kill us now because it was a rumor. It didn't get to that point, obviously. But then there's the recollections of the men who fought, some of them who became leading political figures in the United States Congress, like Daniel Inouye, who basically saw their war service as a way to show their extreme and hyper sense of patriotism. And their memory is that this only showed how loyal we actually were. But I want to stress that in the Japanese American community over many decades after the war, those two elements were at odds and they fought with each other. Some people want to insist, let's tell people what happened to us at home, and others would say, no, let's stress the fact that we served America admirably. Mm-hmm. And over time, there's this shift more towards the, as you said correctly, Matteo, the honoring of the soldiers and less about the internment. Plus, eventually the Americans paid reparations to the Japanese who were interned if they were still alive in the 1980s. They gave each citizen still alive from the camps $20,000. In Japan, in terms of the memory, I may have forgot all the nuances of your question, but the Japanese memory of Pearl Harbor as a justified attack never went away. And there was always some effort, whether at the shrines, or there's a museum right next to the main shrine in Tokyo, Yushukan, I believe is the name of the museum. And once in a while, on the day that Pearl Harbor took place, they would have a special ceremony in honor of the fighter pilots who were so brave during World War II. So they want to honor their soldiers and see it as a justified fight against the Americans. That thread of memory has to compete with, that becomes, if you will, the right-wing memory of the war in Pearl Harbor in Japan. But it has to compete with the pacifism, and it has to compete with the suffering.
Of course.
And just as in Italy, you've got the resistance and you've got those who say, yes, but the resistance caused also a severe suffering for us, or there was some deportation of Jews, not a great deal. So too, there's these elements that contest for attention in the memory of Pearl Harbor and the war in Japan itself.
Thank you very much. Do we have a question or another one?
Yeah, I just had one more question, bringing the discussion a bit more back to the European experience.
Yeah.
So there was another question in Professor Bodner about, of course, how World War II brought about the creation of the NATO alliance and eventually also the EU formation. And many people see that as a very positive result. How do you see the NATO role nowadays in light of the history, and what role could potential new partners play given the different politics and culture that play into that?
I can only give an opinion here. It strikes me that NATO is in a curious position. And by that, I mean that NATO was set up eventually to stop the spread of Soviet power in Eastern Europe and through Europe after World War II. Excuse me. But I really do wonder if, in fact, anybody, including the Russians, want any sort of prolonged military battle right now. I mean, I guess maybe I'm speaking more as someone who wants to see the peace maintained, but what's it going to show? What's it going to accomplish? You're going to establish the economic system. Russia depends on Europe to buy its natural gas. It's a big income generator for Putin. Europe, there's a sort of codependency here. China and the United States are sort of codependent economically. There does seem to be a level of integration in the world today, both in the way our economics and in the way the virus spreads, that suggests that the resort to military alliances to fight each other, while it exists and it's a reality, I'm just not sure that it's a reality that can be used for any realistic purpose.
Thank you, Professor Bodner. Let's see, Professor Pretelli, I think we're just about out of time, but if you wanted to make a final thought, and then I'll wrap everything up.
Do we have time for a very last question?
Sure. I think Professor Bodner, one more question, and then we'll finish.
Sure.
Yeah, no, to be honest, it's not an easy question, probably is silly, but my question is the following. It seems like in the United States, we have a bunch of different memories of World War II. We have local memories, we have national memories, and memories connected to the different phases of World War II. On the national level, we have I think, two major memories. The one of Pearl Harbor and the other one is the D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. There are two different memories. The first one, Pearl Harbor, is a memory of a defeat, but at the very same time is a moment of, let's say, regeneration through violence, using the expression that had been used by Emily Rosenberg in her book about Pearl Harbor. So the idea of the frontier that comes out with Pearl Harbor again. On the other side, the D-Day is more the story of a victory, so it's easier somehow. My silly question, or basic question, if you prefer, is the following. What do you think is more important right now for the American public opinion, for politicians, for ordinary Americans, remembering Pearl Harbor or rather the D-Day? Because if I bring the European perspective, definitely the D-Day is the most important we have about the Americans as, let's say, the liberators. Pearl Harbor is less relevant, I think, but I would like to hear more from you in terms of American perspective on these two different memories.
Well, it's a good question and a good comparison you make. I don't think one is more important than the other. I think they're both important because in the end, both of them have become in American culture and in politics examples and symbols of the nobility and the patriotism of Americans. Their willingness to fight and die for their country and fight and die for a good cause, even though obviously D-Day is more particularly relevant to Europe for sure. But I think they're both important, not because of what I just said, their symbolism of patriotic sacrifice and American virtue and goodness, but also because they've collectively, and the whole notion of the good war has become a sort of a touchstone to counter changes in America since World War II. And so that as subsequent generations have began to live different sorts of lives, who have as moral values have changed, as sexual relations have changed, as race relations have changed, as more chaos and violence have somehow permeated the American homeland, Americans increasingly go back to those two events to show, to argue that we should become again what we were ostensibly in 1940s, and that is the good people in the Great Generation. Mm-hmm. Forgetting, of course, what we were in the 1940s. It was more complicated than that. But the Good War and Pearl Harbor and D-Day have become sort of examples of a narrative and a symbol of what has become a political slogan in our time: "Make America Great Again." and make America Great Again is a way of saying, is basically has become ironically used to make America less democratic again. So I mean, irony of ironies. So I think they're both important, and I think that collectively the memory of the war has become an incredibly important political thread in the contemporary debates in the U.S.
Okay. Professor Bodner, If I may, would you mind staying on? We had a couple of last minute questions. I think I can combine them in from our audience.
Yeah, sure.
From the first one in from Marcella Casagrande is, why do you think Japan decided to attack first in 1941, knowing that they were attacking the greatest military power of the time? Not sure if we were at the time, but I guess culturally, what would be the perspective from that? And then in addition, Antonio Panzone says, according to the attack, what was the impact on public opinion in not only the United States, but other countries?
Yeah, the Japan felt they were justified in attacking. First of all, in terms of greatest power, the poetry I quoted you from Japan basically infers that they were glad they won the battle because they saw us as a superior military power. In other words, they saw this as an upset, a victory over a military power that was superior to their own. They felt they were justified in attacking. Basically, the geopolitics was the fact that they were spreading their empire over East Asia. They needed to draw oil supplies from Indonesia and areas in that region of the world. But the American military power was able to stem or stifle or slow down Japanese access to oil, and to keep the Japanese empire expanding and the military machine fueled. They felt it was a rational decision to wipe out American naval power so that they would be unencumbered in their pursuit of oil. And they kept saying that, many times, etc. You need to remind me. I'm sorry. What the next aspect?
The impact of public opinion.
All over in other parts of the world.
In various parts of the world.
Yeah. To sum it up, generally, most people, even though some in Japan, saw the attack on the part of the Japanese as a foolish move because they felt they would now putting themselves in a position where they would actually have to face a superior military power, which could be destructive, and of course it was. I can tell you that the British were elated because now Churchill got Roosevelt into the war against Germany. I mean, that was a good day for the French resistance and for the British, as there ever will be. I mean, and Roosevelt was happy about it too. And I don't know, I would like to know more and don't know more about how Italians reacted in Italy when Mussolini said, now we're going to go to war against the Americans. I talked to you today about how the Italian Americans reacted, and they shifted gears quickly and sort of dropped their veneration of Mussolini. But if someone wants to contribute before we leave here about how the Italians in Italy reacted, I would like to ask that question to the audience.
Well, Italians were not that happy, especially because in the early 40s, the consent to Mussolini was already declining. And being part of a war against the Americans was not the best choice for the Italians, especially because the connection between Italians and Americans have been traditionally very good. Mussolini from the late 30s tried to depict Americans in a very bad way through anti-American propaganda, but this propaganda has never been successful because the connection through the migration ties that connected many Italian families to the US was so strong. So in that sense, the entry of the United States into the war was seen as a tragedy by many. And that was definitely a major moment for the consent declining of Mussolini in Italy. That's my perception.
That's probably right.
So I'm afraid, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time this afternoon. I definitely want to thank Professor Bodner for his time today, as well as Professor Pretelli and Professor Wulzer, who joined us at the beginning. We really hope that all of our audience members, that you've gained greater awareness and knowledge about the unique intersections between history, politics, and culture, both in the United States and Italy. Thanks to Marcella, Antonio Panzone, Antonio Jr., and also Stefano for your questions this afternoon. And I think in today's ever interconnected world, it's not one country or one people that will look at history and solve all the problems of how we deal with the many challenges that are facing the world today. But it's really about how we work together. It's about creating those partnerships and learning from our past. And so, again, thank you all for joining and participating today. Grazie a tutti. Thank you.
I will just join Karen for to his greetings, and just want to thank John Bodnar for this fantastic moment of sharing, for his lecture, for being here, and of course to the U.S. Consulate in Naples, because it's always good to get stuff made together. So thank you everyone to all participants for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, John.